I want to come back to the two hemispheres. Given their specialization, it's not surprising that in most people, language processing is lateralized to the left hemisphere. With language, sequence matters. Order matters. So it's an analytical task. Seizure activity can transfer from one hemisphere to another in epilepsy via the corpus callosum, this tract of fibers that runs between the left and the right hemispheres. In some cases of severe epilepsy, rather than cutting out the tissue triggering the seizures, surgeons opt to sever the primary route between the left and the right hemispheres. A commissurotomy involves cutting the corpus callosum. By cutting the corpus callosum, surgeons are attempting to keep seizure activity confined locally, and remarkably, it's usually a very successful procedure. Patients who have had this procedure are referred to as split brain patients. Before we go any further, I want to make a clear distinction between two terms, contralateral and ipsilateral. We've already heard these terms before, but I want to make them very clear. Let's first break them apart into their constituent parts. Both words have the suffix lateral, which in this case is really just referring to the word side. So whenever you see lateral, just translate it to side. Contra means opposite. You can remember it because you can think of words like contraband or contrary. Ipsi means same. I'll illustrate that visually here by putting ipsi and lateral on the same side of the screen because they are on the same side, ipsilateral. Contralateral is illustrated on two sides of the screen, opposite to each other, because contra means opposite side. When it comes to contralaterality, vision is quite special. The contralateral organization of vision is by visual field, not by eye. If you follow the flow of information from the left visual field containing the pencil and colored blue, you can see that information first makes it to the right half of each eye. So it's not that the left visual field goes to the right eye, it actually goes to the right half of both eyes. The information from the ipsilateral eye crosses over so that the pencil ends up entirely in the right hemisphere, the contralateral hemisphere. Researchers have devised some very interesting experiments for split brain patients to illustrate the specialization of the two hemispheres. In the procedure illustrated here, the split brain patient was asked to fixate at center so that words presented in the left visual field ended up in the right hemisphere, while words presented to the right visual field ended up in the left hemisphere. The researchers then flashed up words like key and ring on a trial and asked the patient to report what he saw. In this case, the patient would verbally report the word ring, because that's the word visible to the left hemisphere, and that's the hemisphere that can talk and answer questions verbally. But the right hemisphere knows that it saw a word, and the right hemisphere can read. Its lexical entries tend to be confined to concrete words, but a word like key it could understand. It just couldn't report it verbally. The researchers then asked the patient to reach under the screen and pick up an object with his left hand, controlled by the silent right hemisphere, and the patient would pick up key.
So by using this gadget that we've made, we can prevent that. It's just true that the anatomy of the human visual system allows so that when a person fixates on a central point, what one sees to the left of that point is projected to the right hemisphere, and what one sees to the right of that point is projected into the left hemisphere. So that a split brain person can be sitting here, and when we flash on a picture, say an orange, into the right visual field, that information is only projected into the left hemisphere. And we found that the patient says that he describes it as an orange, and no matter what the stimuli, words, pictures, they describe in a correct manner. Similar visual stimuli are flashed into the left visual field, which go to the right hemisphere, such as a fork, like you see here. The patient will say, when asked, the experiment will ask, what did you see? And the patient will say, I didn't see anything. And the experimenter will then say, well, pick out the card that best describes what you may have seen. And sure enough, the patient goes out very calmly and points to the word fork. So that what happens in the split brain patient is that all the sensory information that is projected and arrives in the left hemisphere can be talked about. But all that information that arrives in the right hemisphere is perceived and acted upon, but it is not talked about because the patient has no awareness of it in terms of his ability to verbally, audibly express it out loud.
If speech originates in the left half of the brain, are there any functions special to the other half? Here, a split brain subject provides the answer. As he tries to copy this pattern with blocks, we discover his ability is confined to his right half brain.
Now let's remember that the left hand is governed from the right hemisphere, and you will see that he has absolutely no problem in solving the problem. When the patient tries to solve the problem with his right hand, which is governed from the left hemisphere, we find that he is not capable of doing it. Namely, that the right hand, which is governed from the left hemisphere, is intrinsically incapable of performing this kind of visual constructional tasks. It's interesting to note that the whole perspective is gone. He has 3-in-1 block combinations. It doesn't even square them up. You can see the left hand wants to keep helping the right and is interfering. Well, we've now seen that the left hand can perform the problem and that the right hand cannot. Now the question becomes, what happens when you allow both hands together to try to solve the problem? And what we find out is that they fight over each other. One hand knows how to do it, and one hand does not, and so they more or less squabble. And the reason for this is that the hemispheres are disconnected. The right hemisphere controls the left hand, and the left hemisphere controls the right hand. And these are almost mutually independent systems. It was as if two people were fighting over performing this task. One knew how and one didn't, and one would fight for dominance of the situation.
To say that the right hemisphere has no role in language is oversimplifying things. Yes, it's the left hemisphere that controls the production of language, but the right hemisphere is actually specialized for aspects of language not processed well in the left hemisphere, and that tends to be related to its more global role in holistic processing. Prosody refers to the fluctuations in the low frequency portion of the speech signal. The role of prosody is really for conveying emotion. It's going to be what you can say about a conversation that you're hearing through a door. It'll be muffled, but you're going to understand whether or not it's an argument or whether or not two people are maybe flirting with each other. It also has an additional role for conveying syntactically helpful information. We often use different pitches or intonations at the end of a declaration versus a statement and versus a question. So it's really related to that holistic processing of language. Patients with aphasia due to right hemisphere lesions can distinguish between questions and statements using prosody alone. So even though they aren't able to understand the individual words because their left hemisphere is damaged, they can still figure out what category of statement versus question that they're hearing. On the other hand, patients with right hemisphere lesions show impairment in perception of prosody cues related to tonal aspects of verbal stimuli. So, for example, these patients with right hemisphere damage have no problem producing normal speech, but they might actually apply prosody inappropriately. So they might sound like they're being really pushy or angry when in fact that's not what they're trying to convey at all. Moreover, lesions to the right hemisphere, in the right frontal cortex in particular, can lead to a complete lack of prosody, similar to monotonous voices of salespeople on the phone. So the right hemisphere is really about this more global understanding of language. Related to that, narrative and inference seems to be processed in the right hemisphere. Patients with damage to the right hemisphere often have difficulty putting a series of sentences in the right order or a series of words in the right order in order to make a sentence. They also have difficulty extracting the theme from a passage or deciding which information is relevant or not because they're really not seeing that big picture or that coherent storyline that we see and that we use to help fill in the blanks. So, for example, determining which sentence is relevant in the gist of the story, most people can do that no problem. Moreover, if you're hearing a sentence like, John walked in the water near some glass, he grabbed his foot and called the lifeguard for help, most people are really going to infer that there was an accident there. But patients with right hemisphere damage are going to lack this ability to create a coherent narrative or draw inferences that way. People with right hemisphere damage often also have difficulty interpreting metaphors or sarcasm because they are figurative and non-literal. Similarly, indirect requests when info is needed to be interpreted non-literally can be problematic. So, for example, if you ask a patient with right hemisphere damage, could you tell me where the bathroom is? They might respond, yes, yes, I can, without actually understanding that you're requesting the location of the bathroom from them. Similarly, they might have difficulty comprehending jokes because jokes often require making inferences or play with what's figurative and what's literal. Two hydrogen atoms meet. One says, I've lost my electron. The other says, are you sure? The first replies, I'm positive. Here, you have to understand the juxtaposition between the literal relationship between atoms and electrons and the figurative use of I'm positive, which for people with right hemisphere damage would be very difficult.